Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Centre for Independent Studies. I'm joined today by New South Wales Senator Andrew Bragg. Janet Albrechtsen described him as the man who took on the big super bullies and won. He's the author of Bad Egg, How to Fix Super, and it is a pleasure to have him here virtually today.
Thanks, Simon. Great to see you again.
Terrific. Now, in that article that I quoted by Janet, she described the government's Your Future, Your Super legislation as the biggest shake-up of super funds since the mandatory system was established in 1988. Can you give us a brief synopsis of what the government's done and why you think it's so important?
Well, Simon, one of the problems with super is that it has a focus on feathering the nests of vested interests, and that is perhaps inevitable because super is the only industry in Australia where you open the door and the money just pours in the door.
Other than government, of course.
But this is something that Canberra has created, ostensibly to get people off the pension, to reduce the cost of the ageing population to the taxpayer over the time. And it hasn't done those things. So what it has done is it has created a huge pool of vested interests in the finance sector and in the union movement, where their answer to every question is more and more super. And so there have been major structural problems. For example, the super system has no stated objective. Fees and costs are out of control, and there have been a lot of poor performers. Not to mention, multiple accounts. I think at one stage we had, 30 or 40 million accounts in Australia for a labour market of only 11 million. And so the Your Future, Your Super reforms, which have been delivered by the Morrison government, now put in place a performance test, will put an end to multiple accounts. And critically, Simon, they will put in place a best financial interest test. So super funds won't be allowed anymore to send all their money over to the unions, set up newspapers like the New Daily to attack their political opponents, and to run, political advertising with Greg Combay's face on it anymore. So that is a very big step forward, which was achieved in the last parliamentary session.
Critics have painted some of these reforms, at least, as motivated by an ideological attack on unions. To be clear, I think the industry super funds are financially very important to the union movement. However, it is also the case that industry funds have massively outperformed the retail sector for a long time now. Is this really just union bashing, or is there a genuine conflict of interest here?
I think the retail funds have performed very poorly, and the Hayne Royal Commission really showed that the retail funds all too often will focus on shareholders, not on their members, and therefore were breaching their fiduciary obligations. I think the industry funds have performed poorly during the COVID crisis, insofar as they have always been focused on their interests, not on the national interests. So, for example, when we put in place the early release scheme in April last year at the height of the pandemic, the super fund said, well, we can't do this. We can't possibly be asked to help the country, even though we're facing an economic shock. And they cried about illiquidity or liquidity problems that they were going to face by virtue of taking $30 billion from a $3 trillion system, right? So this is ridiculous stuff. So I think they have shown themselves to be only interested in their own interests, not in the national interests, certainly not in their interests, the interests of their members.
But that's the issue, isn't it, Senator? Because super funds are not actually supposed to be run in the national interest. They're supposed to be run, according to your legislation, in the best financial interest of members, correct?
That's right. And I think the fact that they would argue against a scheme that would help people pay down debts and mortgages during the height of a serious economic shock shows that they're not interested in the people that they're supposed to be working for. They're only interested in having more and more funds under management to charge fees upon. I think that has been a very clear sense that they held and very regrettable. But in terms of performance, I mean, my view is if you have high-performing funds, that is great. What we don't want to see is laggards who are only returning, 4 or 5% over the decade when you have other options like the Future Fund, which are returning more like 9%.
Well, I think we can get to that. Before we leave the Your Future, Your Super legislation. I mean, I think you were there were a number of coalition backbenchers and potential junior ministers who had made a lot of noise about the problems with increasing the super guarantee to 10%. I mean, we canvassed them, I think, in our event last year. Unfortunately, the government rolled over on its hints, at least, that it was looking at deferring that increase to 10% or making some or all of it voluntary. In the end, the government caved on these issues. Why is it, with all these problems in super, why is the government mandating that we give them more money?
Well, I think the view of the executive government was that if you're going to proceed with the 12%, then we need to get a better functioning industry, and that's what your super will partly do, because it will ensure that there aren't more multiple accounts. It will put in place the best financial interest test, and it will start testing the funds. And I think that is a very important price for the 12%, because there's no point putting more and more money into a system that doesn't work. I mean, from a personal point of view, I wouldn't have proceeded with the increase until all the structural issues were fixed. One of the structural issues which we're going to talk about today is default status. I mean, the funds that receive default status today are either receiving that because they are in an industrial agreement, like an award, or they've been grandfathered through an enterprise agreement. And many of these funds are poor performing funds. But again, the whole structure of the industry and the system still lacks an objective. I mean, what are we actually trying to achieve here? So I think we need to do more work on the whole idea of super, which I think, Simon, is actually quite a good idea. It just hasn't been executed very well. So there are people in Canberra that would like to demolish the whole system. I'm not one of those people. I would rather fix it and throw it in the bin.
So what is, in your mind, what is the objective of super, and what is the rationale for government providing tens of billions of dollars of tax concessions specifically for super as opposed to other forms of saving?
Well, I'd say there's three things that should be top of mind in terms of setting objectives, which, by the way, was a recommendation of the Murray Financial Inquiry back in 2014, that there should be an objective for super.
And their objective, right, was that it should either supplement or supplant the age pension, correct?
Yes, and I think that would be part of an objective. I mean, again, this scheme was written up on the back of a coaster in a Canberra pub, which was subsequently lost to history. And at the time when it was brought in by the Keating government, I mean, Treasury didn't have it was done against Treasury wishes. And so the whole thing has been a real cluster from the get-go. And we'll come to these issues in a minute about the default system. But all of this goes back to 91, 92 when it was legislated, all these problems. And it is very regrettable, because it is a fundamentally intergenerational policy idea, which has now been running for a whole generation, but is not working particularly well. So on the objective, I would say get people off the pension. I would say that it should be reducing the costs to taxpayers over the long run, not increasing the cost to taxpayers. I mean, at the moment, you've got a system that costs vastly more than it saves.
Depending on how you measure it, though, right? Because if you, without wanting to get into the weeds of how you measure superannuation tax concessions, there's a pretty strong argument that says you shouldn't treat long-term savings the same way you treat income in terms of taxation, right?
That's right. But I think the tax expenditure statement would say that regardless of how you measure it, it's still well in excess of the reputed savings that were in the intergenerational report. And the third objective, I would say, is it should improve people's lives in retirement. Now, one of the critiques that I would make and Tim Wilson would make is that super makes home ownership harder, and the whole basis of a secure and safe retirement demands that people own a home. I mean, if you are renting in retirement, you're going to have a pretty challenging retirement. And so we don't want super to be cutting away the opportunity for Australians to secure a first home, given for a whole lot of reasons that the CIS has published papers on in the past, getting a home as a first homeowner is harder than it's ever been.
I think that's right. As someone who was responsible for writing up a bulk of that research, thank you for the plug on that. But I think that point is really important. I mean, superannuation is paid for out of workers' wages. By forcing people into superannuation, by forcing them to save in a particular way, you are taking away other choices. Yet what we are seeing over time is, again and again, pushes to expand the system to include people, for example, who are earning less than $450 a month. There's almost no benefit to those people from superannuation savings. The Grattan Institute, for example, showed that for some people on lower incomes, super actually makes their living standards worse because they would have a reasonably similar living standard on the pension than they would from their income. Why is it then that the system is expanding and expanding and expanding?
Well, because governments have decided to increase the guarantee, and that is a policy judgment they have made. But as I say, I think the concession that's been extracted, which is a very significant one in the past few months, has been the Your Future, Your Super reforms, because they will at least ensure that the system is much more focused and efficient. But there is more that we should do. And I guess my judgment is that ensuring that the default settings are optimal is the most important setting. But there are other things that we should look at as well, including the objective, including ways to leverage super for home ownership. And I think that there are a whole lot of ways that can be done. One of my parliamentary colleagues, Jason Flinsky, is chairing an inquiry into home ownership at the moment. And I think that will look at how super and home ownership could come together. I mean, one of the things I'm most committed to as a parliamentarian is making sure that Australians can have every opportunity to have access to a first home, because I think that is it transcends any other thing that I can think of. Because if people have a first home, people have a home, I think they have a much greater stake in society, and I think that's a good thing.
Comment from one of our viewers, Glenn. Tony Abbott was the first PM to delay the promised increases. To make anything of the fact it's passed is hardly anything to crow about. Getting a home for the first homeowner is a failure of government policy. Why should superannuation be the default source instead of government fixing the problem?
Well, as you know from the CIS's very good research in this area, planning and state governments are responsible for a lot of the issues in this space. But it is just not true to say that super has no relevance in the first home ownership discussion. I mean, of course, the super industry will always try and buy off experts and people to say that, if you let people have their super, you'll have an explosion in house prices. But that ignores the fact of the supply issues and the other demand issues. I would say that for lower income people, the trade-off between the super guarantee contribution and the ability to get a first home deposit together of several tens of thousands of dollars, depending on where you live, is very material and very serious.
Oh, I think that's right. But what we should, before we get on to your reforms, which I'm very keen to talk about, very, very keen. One of the arguments that has been brought up to me in the past and to others is that superannuation is supposed to be a long-term investment. The idea is that, you get the settings in place and then over time your balance builds up. What we've seen, I think, ever since the super system was introduced, but certainly in the last 10 years, is reform after reform after reform. Changing the rules constantly, how much can be contributed, the circumstances, the balance caps, now the default system. How are people supposed to have confidence in the system long term when they see the rules change over and over again?
Well, I agree that there have been a lot of changes over the long term, but I think on this particular issue of ensuring people get the best possible deal if they're not engaged, I do think that is a setting that if you're not engaged, you're not going to particularly notice. I mean, the great trick the industry has pulled on people has been to try and make it as confusing, complex, and opaque as possible. And so what we've tried to do with these last set of reforms, your super changes, and then I'm hoping we'll do some more reform, is to try and make it simple, clean and tidy so that people can engage. Because after all, it is people's money. And I do think the early release scheme was very engaging in that people became aware that this is their money, they could use it if need be. I mean, I personally think that we should have a permanent early release scheme for people because it is, after all, their money. I mean, you can, of course, on the day you reach preservation age, spend the whole lot on whatever you want to spend it on. So I think that there are a whole lot of peculiar settings here that we should keep on looking at.
Another comment from one of our viewers, Matthew: rebating the super guarantee to an average wage earner in Sydney and Melbourne won't get them across the line for a new home. Prices far outstrip servicing and lending criteria. This is not a silver bullet, obviously. This is part of a solution that absolutely has to, as my colleague, Chief Economist Peter Tulip has said, has to address the issues and bottlenecks around supply.
It is not a silver bullet, and I'm not holding it out to be one, but I think it would certainly help. And I've had constituents write to me setting out their personal circumstances where they might be earning $50,000 or $60,000 a year, and this would make a real difference if they could access their accumulated super, right? So let's say if they were in their late 30s, they wanted to purchase a first home, a flat in Sydney, let's say for $1 million, and they had, $40,000 or $50,000 in their super, maybe they had more, then that would be a serious boost. I mean, that is, I don't want to put words in people's mouths here, but I mean, I've had people write to me saying that this is their only prospect of ever getting a deposit together. So I think denying people that is just mean.
And they wouldn't, of course, have to actually withdraw the money, for example. They could use it as a guarantee for the 20% deposit that we need to cover that gap. It wouldn't actually have to be physically provided. Look, let's get into your latest publication on super. It's a proposal you're calling Super Guarantee Australia. And the topic is, of course, competition for workers' superannuation. Can you give me your elevator pitch? What is Super Guarantee Australia?
Well, the whole idea here is that the Future Fund has been a good fund over the last 10 years. It's returned, I think, more than 9%. And that far outweighs the returns on many of the default funds, some of which have only returned 5-6%. And that this could be a way to have a simple, clean default fund, which has proven to be successful, manage the workers' money. I think it's an idea that is well worth considering. Just
to be clear here, because this is quite a bold proposal, you are a Liberal senator calling for effectively the nationalisation of default super. In your publication, you describe that as removing protectionism. Isn't this a violation of your party's free market principles?
Well, the whole idea of super has nothing to do with the market because it's compulsory. It's a compulsory product established in legislation. So, certainly if the super industry want to lecture me about markets and competition, I'll take that with a grain of salt because the compulsion that's written into the law means that we have a very heavy stake. That is, Canberra has a very heavy stake in making sure it works properly. So, in the past, when there's been inquiries into this whole idea of having super, it was always recommended that there would be a government default fund. That was rejected by the Keating government when it put in place super, and it gave the keys to the city to the unions and to the finance sector. And I think that was a mistake because you've seen that there's been a lot of waste over the past 30 years. And so I think if we're going to have compulsory super, we should definitely have a government product in the market as a benchmark. And I think the Future Fund would be the obvious choice for us to do that with. And I think that the changes that this paper seeks feedback on, I think are relatively modest legislative changes that we could enact quite easily.
Well, but they're not that modest, are they? You're talking about, what is it, $36 trillion in super by the time we reach 2060. A good portion of that would flow into the default funds over a period of time. There's no question if you had one government default fund that most people went into, given the relative lack of attention people pay to super, that your government future fund for workers could have tens of trillions of dollars in it. That's not modest, surely.
Well, I mean, that money is going to be there anyway, because the concentration risk the nation faces in having such a significant policy like super means that that money will be controlled by the financiers and by the unions in any event. So my sense is, if you had a clean and simple default fund, people could be a member of that fund and they might be happy there, but they could also, of course, exercise choice. I mean, a large part of the assets in the super industry are, of course, not in default. They're in self-managed super funds, and they're in wraps, and they're in other choice products. So I think you're still going to see a large amount of people who are opting to choose their own adventure on super, so to speak. What this is saying is, we're not going to allow really the dud funds to keep on accepting default contributions and returning 5-6% over the last 10 years when they could have received more than 9% in the future fund.
Isn't removal of those dud funds one of the motivations for your future, your super? Why will that not achieve the objective that you've set out here?
Well, I think that could help, but I still think that the whole idea of Canberra washing its hand and outsourcing the whole compulsory system to other parties is flawed. I think we have a successful fund, the Future Fund. We have retail capacity through the Commonwealth Super Corporation. The Future Fund could quite easily swallow up the Commonwealth Super Corporation, and you could have a product in the market which I think would be very competitive. And my view is, we have to take our responsibilities more seriously if we're going to compel people to put their money into super. I mean, it's a very paternalistic idea.
I agree 100% that it's very paternalistic. It's somewhat jarring for me to hear you, who've been a long time, I think, defender of free markets, talk about how effective and efficient the government delivery of this service will be. You seem very confident that government will deliver a better rate of return on super than either the unions or the retail funds. Why do you think that?
Well, I think you have to look at some of the worst performances are in the retail sector, but there are also very poor performers in the industry sector, especially on the bottom end. And I just think they've had 30 years of super. Why would we give them another 30 years?
One of the viewers on the stream, Chris White, has suggested, hi Andrew, why is the Future Fund outperforming industry funds? Is it about them investing in different classes of assets? Is it about better internal management or versus external management? What's actually going on the ground here? Why is the Future Fund getting 9% and the average retail fund being 6.5%?
Oh, well, I imagine that it's superior management overall. I mean, I think I make the point here about fees that, I think there has been a healthy discussion about fees, but I don't think that fees are the ultimate marker here. I mean, the ultimate marker here is performance. So I don't think we should be, trying to have a 2 basis point industry. But the Future Fund, I think, has performed strongly because of its superior management. And again, I'd say I wouldn't be seeking to stop a higher fee approach if it was going to deliver a higher return. But the crux of this system would be based around the idea that Canberra has said you have to have compulsory super. And so therefore, we're going to take that obligation seriously because we are engaging in fundamentally a liberal paternalistic policy by taking away 10%, soon to be 12% of your money, and giving it to the finance sector or the unions.
So basically, and this is a comment from Matthew again, that there's not much more paternalistic than a big government fund, right? I suppose your point is that if you're going to be paternalistic, you might as well do it properly.
Let's just do it properly. Let's do it how every other country does it. I mean, every country that has a compulsory pension scheme, as far as I can see, has a government default fund, right? Has a low-cost government default fund, which is a benchmark. I mean, you can't have it both ways. I mean, the whole thing is paternalistic. This is not a market. I mean, there's no way. I mean, no one has ever argued in the history of the world that the Australian superannuation industry would be $3 trillion without a government mandate. But I mean, the whole idea of just outsourcing the whole thing and not worrying about how it's going, I think is very poor and weak and unambitious. I mean, we should be wanting to have a super system that works over the long term. We don't want to have a scheme that results in everyone still being on the pension and the cost to the taxpayer increasing. I mean, just because we want to adhere to some magical principle. We have the system. It's not going to go anywhere. We should try and fix it up.
Well, let's talk about some of the ways that it can be fixed up. One of the things that you cite heavily, and I and others have brought up repeatedly, is the fees charged by super funds. Other than the people who are directly connected to super funds, everyone accepts they're too high, right? You argue that the government fund will charge less, and you're clearly alive here, I think, to the issue of competitive neutrality and how it impacts on this particular point. So I just want to read from the 96 statement on that for a second. Competitive neutrality requires that governments should not use their legislative or fiscal powers to advantage their own businesses over the private sector. It goes on to talk about how that will result in inefficient allocation of resources because the government fund won't be charging a market rate for its services. Isn't that really what we're doing here? We're legislatively preferring government super as the default fund, and then we're forcing that fund to set a price that doesn't reflect the market rates.
Well, we don't have to have super, but we do. So the first point is we're going to have super and we're going to put our own product on the table because we think that if it's important enough for us to force people through paternalism to have super, then we're going to have a product. Knowing, as we have learned over the last 30 years, that many of the funds are not focused on their performance for the workers. They are focused on their own issues. They're focused on politics. They're focused on feathering their own nests. I mean, it's not as if we haven't had extensive inquiries into this system. We know that this is a major principal agent issue. So I think the way that this needs to be done is it needs to be done in a way which makes it very easy for people to choose and to opt into a different fund or scheme. But I think that the way that you deal with competitive neutrality is effectively just that you say, well, we're not going to heavily subsidise this fund in any way other than designating it as the default fund, as we do now with the MySuper products.
So, for example, to reason by analogy here, the government provides significant financial incentives for people to take up private health insurance. There are penalties on individuals who are high income earning and who don't have private health insurance. The government, however, has a legislative scheme that basically sets the premiums for those health funds. Isn't a far less intrusive way to solve the problem you're talking about simply say, super funds, if you want to be a default super fund and be named as a default super fund, your maximum fee is 0.5%?
Well, I personally am not attracted to the idea of fee caps because I think that can restrain the ability of the trustees to get the best return. I'm also not of the view that we should be trying to restrain investment into Australia or into any sort of Australian projects or boondoggles. I think that's risky. I think if you look at the overseas experience where countries have compulsory pension schemes, they have a government product. I mean, this is not revolutionary. This is what you see in other jurisdictions, is what you see in Singapore and Canada and in New Zealand and the UK and the like. So you see variations of these schemes abroad. I just don't think that setting fee caps is going to be the way to go. I'd rather go this way because I think you want people to focus on returns. I mean, my argument is not about what fee we're going to charge workers. My argument is how do we get the best possible return for workers, because ultimately that's what they're going to receive. And that's what is designed, of course, if you follow the undefined logic here, or the undefined objective, is to get people off the pension. So by virtue of having more money in your super, you should be able to be off the pension.
And you cite in your report the intergenerational report figures. I think the last intergenerational report, the one released a couple of months ago, is the first one that shows age pension figures decreasing. I think if we were to be fair about why that is, I think a large portion of that is because the taper rates were moved back to the settings that they were in the 90s and early 2000s, and the balance caps have been introduced that will basically result in sort of a more significant tapering of people at the top end. The reality is, of course, though, a significant proportion of people will still be on the age pension, even when the system is mature. In part, that is, of course, by design. But when we talk about getting people off the age pension, are you talking about getting an average income worker off the age pension permanently? Is it about basically shifting that age pension point out 10 years so that instead of being eligible for the age pension at sort of 67, it's 77? I mean, what's the objective in terms of reducing pension expenditure?
We want to have fewer people on the pension over time, of course, and that is an objective that is a bipartisan objective. I think that the reality is for the average worker, I mean, you need to be putting away about 15%, 20% of your salary over the course of your life. And no government is ever going to mandate a compulsory super contribution of 20%. So the solutions here are not more paternalism. The solutions here are engaging people with the knowledge that if they wanted to be off the pension, they would need to save more. Now, the foundation of that is having a house and then having some savings on top of that. I mean, that is what all the research shows that you'd be aware of. And so if we had a simpler, cleaner, easy to engage with super system that was honest with people about how much more they needed to save, I think that would be a really big difference in people's lives. When the super funds never really tell you that you need to save XXX more money to become self-funded because they want to have you forever.
Yeah, that's right. They set a living standard. And what we saw, I think it was in 2019, research from the Grattan Institute showed that if you tweak that retirement standard in a way that's slightly more realistic, you discover that 90-something% of people under the current settings have sufficient super. So, you know, there's where you set that line makes a big difference, right?
You know, we want people to be self-funded, but we don't need people to be forced into that. In fact, I think it's very hard to force people to become self-funded. I think it's something that they have to co-own at least. And the super funds, if they were incentivised correctly, I think could play an important role in getting people to become self-funded, which I think is a laudable policy goal. So,
yeah, and obviously, if we talk about the pension, as viewer Dr. Carolyn Curry points out, that the real issue around pension eligibility is actually the home, not being included in the assets or even the income test. And if you were to do that in some way, particularly as my report with Matthew Taylor found in 2014, if you were incentivising people to use that equity in your home, you would find a way to boost living standards without having to quarantine even more of workers' money, right?
Well, I think that there are a lot of sensitivities around those issues.
Yeah. We're bold enough to talk about government super funds, but let's leave the home out of the assets test.
I think
right?
one issue a day, I think.
Can we get back to the point on competition? Because I think at the end of the day, a lot of what's happening here really comes down to competition or the lack of competition. Super funds can get away with high fees, underperformance, because everybody's money's got to go somewhere. And a lot of people, I think particularly people who are not high income earners, they're not thinking about superannuation until they're in their 40s or even later for some of them. And a lot of people who are active in managing their superannuation are looking at the self-managed route to get out of this mess altogether. So, which leads me to two questions. Firstly, if people actually don't care enough to move their money somewhere where it's better performing and the fees are lower, why are you spending political capital to try and help them?
Well, because I think we are so invested in this scheme as a country, and Canberra is responsible for this. So we can't have a whole legion of parliamentarians and policymakers just wash their hands and pretend that super is not something that they need to think about. So I think we have a moral obligation to ensure that people are getting the best possible return on their own money, given that we have caused this incursion into their private affairs. So that is, I think, a moral imperative.
It's interesting you just use the phrase incursion into their private affairs because, I mean, ultimately, right, a lot of the reforms proposed in the super space over the course of the last 5-6 years in particular, aside from those that were designed just to grab more tax dollars, a lot of them have been designed to get around the problems caused by compulsion. If superannuation was voluntary or if the higher rate of contributions were voluntary, wouldn't the funds have to be more competitive and wouldn't that fix your problem?
Well, I think that's right. And you would be aware that I've flagged some of these issues in the past.
I would be, yes.
And look, I think there's a strong level of support for the idea of compulsory super, and that is understandable.
Well, isn't that because people misunderstand how super works, right? It's because they think that it's a bonus that employers are paying them on top of their wages.
Yes, that's right. And the research shows that people think it's free money. And I guess the super funds have treated it like confetti. So everyone thinks it's free money, or too many people think it's free money. But when you see the super guarantee ratcheting up, as you did this year in July, people were aware in many instances where their pay was being cut. So I think there is more of in an era of lower wages growth. I think people will be more aware of super guarantee increases ratcheting up. I mean, when Stephen Kennedy was at Senate Estimates, I asked him about this, whether or not the super guarantee increases were going to eat away wages growth that the Treasury had built into the budget. And his answer was that the positive wages growth will be eaten in the out years by the super guarantee. So people will, unless you're working for the public sector, where frankly, sadly, a lot of people are immune from these changes, just like I think many people who work in the public sector and in larger businesses have had a good crisis. Meanwhile, people who are running small businesses, if they're barbers or travel agents or beauticians, have lost their businesses, have lost their mental health, and it has been a truly gruesome period.
But aren't those the people you want to run your government super fund? No?
Who? The small business people?
No, the public servants who are immune from some of these wage concerns.
Well, I think you can look at the returns yourself and look at what the Future Fund has been able to achieve as a independent agency over the long run. Now, this is not my data, but the data shows that the Future Fund has beaten the market.
I want to pick up on one word that you said then, independent agency. One of the common features, I think, particularly of social security systems around the world, which is I mean, it's slightly different to government-run pension schemes, but the concept is not dissimilar, is that they've proven to be honeypots for government spending. So in the US, for example, there's a massive unfunded liability in their social security because they've basically loaned all their social security money to the government to spend. There is a risk here, right, if we create this enormous pot of money, that a future government will use investment policy in the future fund to achieve political objectives, either through directly funding government projects that they want to get up around, particular infrastructure or even investments in health and education, or by forcing the fund to divest itself of assets in industries that they don't like. Isn't that a big risk?
Well, I mean, it needs to have the same principles applied that are applied to the super funds. It needs to be a sole purpose test. There must not be any piercing of that sole purpose for any purpose at all. And, as I've been in public office for a couple of years, and I could tell you that there are thousands of things that people would like the super funds to fund. But even as someone who's been critical of the super industry, I would always defend its right to invest solely for the benefit of its members, which is why I resist things like fee caps and any sort of parochialism here, Simon, because I don't think parochialism and investing go hand in hand. And so the point here is you would apply the existing framework, which is a sole purpose test to this fund, and you'd have to also apply a performance test to this fund. You wouldn't be able to give it any special deal other than designating it default status, which is what we designate now to my super license funds.
Well, I think broadly that's right, but surely there's a risk that will happen either. So as we've seen, for example, with the ABC, that the culture of the organisation shifts in a particular direction, or that a future government will, basically argue, as we're starting to see some in the industry super ranks argue, that there's, with that vast investment comes a social responsibility. Can we actually prevent not just your notional government future fund, but how would we actually prevent private or industry or retail super funds from exercising that level of political control? Well,
I mean, we already run a $300 billion fund, the Commonwealth Super Corporation, and no one has ever said that there should be any particular investment arrangements put in place for political purposes. And I think that would be something that the finance minister would have to maintain as part of their ministerial duty statement, and would not interfere in any way in the investments. I don't want to give you a short answer here, but I do think that this whole purpose test is something that already exists, has actually served the industry reasonably well as a structure. I don't think it's been adhered to, but it is a clean structure that could be applied here. And if the finance minister felt under duress for political reasons, I think the finance minister would have to say, well, I'm sorry, but the super funds and this particular super fund is there for the benefit of the members and the workers. It's not there for any other political purpose. And I think that would be a very clear message that people would understand.
Viewer Anthony Carr, thanks for watching, Anthony, long-time friend of the CIS, asks, does a sole purpose test preclude funds from refusing to invest in, say, the coal industry?
No, I mean, I think you'd see today that the super funds are invested in fossil fuels. Some are not invested in fossil fuels. I think if we look at the future funds portfolio, I think that has a reasonable exposure to some fossil fuels. Now, these are judgments for the trustees to make. I think some funds, up until only a couple of years ago, were investing in tobacco, firearms, and the like. So it's not for me to apply a moral duty on the investments made by a super fund trustee or by a government trustee.
But didn't, for example, in the recent changes, the Your Future, Your Super changes, didn't the Treasurer want the power to ban super funds from making particular investments?
Well, I don't think that was a policy that was proceeded with.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't, but it was certainly part of the package of reforms initially, right?
Well, it wasn't in bad egg.
So you're not going to defend that one. Okay. Look, I get the sense that your proposal here might not be particularly popular on the other side of the political aisle. Yeah, and it's funny, right? Because after years of hearing how great big government is and how government is perfect to deliver every particular service we can find, super might be the only thing that the left of politics doesn't want government to run. What are the prospects that something like this could actually happen?
Well, I think it would be resisted heavily by the vested interests. I mean, you've got the biggest vested interest in Australia, the super funds who receive more than $100 billion every year of our money. And on that $100 billion, they charge $30 billion in fees every year, which is just unbelievable, right? I mean, you think about that, $100 billion comes in the door and you take $30 billion in fees. So that has enabled them to buy and build huge coalitions in Canberra and beyond, set up think tanks, newspapers and the lot. So these will be heavily resisted changes, just as the Your Future, Your Super changes were heavily resisted. And furthermore, the changes that the Turnbull government passed to put in place the ABCC, the Building Construction Commission and the Registered Organisations Commission. I mean, the unions didn't want those, and those were heavily resisted. So these sort of changes are always hard to get through. But I do think that this idea could be quite popular because I think people have a good view of the Future Fund.
Have you had any indication from the Future Fund itself that it would be open to pursuing something like this?
Well, I've asked them questions at Senate estimates, and I think it's something that they could quite easily do. I mean, what they don't have is retail capacity. And by retail capacity, I mean they don't have the capacity to deal with hundreds and thousands of people. But the organisation that does have that capacity is the Commonwealth Super Corporation, which is an administrator, a fund that has its own trustee license. So that does everything except for insurance, which you could still outsource. So if you allowed the Future Fund to eat up the Commonwealth Super Corporation, you could do all your front end call centre stuff, administration, trusteeship arrangements, and then also your investment management. So, I mean, it wouldn't be a particularly difficult change for the Future Fund to enact.
One of the interesting potential wrinkle here is if the investments of the Future Fund went poorly, for example, and we do see sometimes, not only that super underperforms, but occasionally funds do fall over, would the government be worried about any political blowback or feel an obligation to provide taxpayers' funds to make up for losses or poor performance of people in the government super fund?
Well, I think it would be good if Canberra felt more connected to the outcomes of the super system, because at the moment we compel people to give 10% of their money to the financiers and the unions, but we don't care, or often we don't care enough about what the return is. So I think having more skin in the game is appropriate. I mean, we are half pregnant here with this scheme. So I think we need to make sure that for the people that are disengaged, default members, that we take our responsibility more seriously.
Just sort of going to wrap up here in a minute, but I'm interested in, you've mentioned a number of times how systems similar to these operate overseas. I know, for example, that there's a system in Canada. I think there's a California pension trust as well that's run at the state level. Can you give the viewers some sense of how these schemes work in practice overseas?
Well, the Singapore Mandatory Provident Scheme, I think, is a good example, which has been run successfully by the state there. Equally, in the UK, have the Nest schemes, which again have been, I think, quite low cost and quite effective. So I think there's a lot of knowledge we could draw on from offshore. But again, I think the ease of these changes would not be, I should say, I don't think these would be particularly hard changes to legislate. But I think getting the support for this, given the scale of the vested interest and the walls of money, I think will make it a very challenging reform. But we have shown in recent months that we have been able to get some structural reforms through. So perhaps after 30 years, there is a real reckoning that we want to have this system and we want to have it work properly.
At the risk slightly of putting you on the spot here, one of the things that we haven't talked about, we've talked a lot about superaccumulation. We haven't talked about what happens in the retirement phase. And I think one thing that we have seen is a continual focus on changes and reforms of the accumulation end and a relative lack of focus at the retirement phase. And one of the things that I think is probably the most concerning aspects of the super system, aside from, the tax arrangements and the default arrangements, is how clunky and ineffective some of the distribution is at the back end. Do you have any sense of ways that we could make super work better in retirement rather than just in accumulation?
Well, I mean, the question is, how do you incentivise good behaviour? Because I don't think that trying to force people to do anything with their money after it's been locked up for 40 years already is a good approach. So can we incentivise people to purchase annuities, deferred annuities and the like? I think those are very valid questions. I think that there are many retirees that take their money into account-based pensions that are very exposed to a small number of asset classes, mainly Australian equities. I think that has caused great market risk. But I mean, governments have been reluctant to tell people what to do with their money because, of course, we're already very paternalistic in having people take away their money for 40 years. But I do think that there are opportunities for incentivising good behaviour rather than trying to force good behaviour.
Are you worried, and this issue comes up from time to time, are you worried about the issue of people holding on to their super as a bequest, particularly, the idea that you can spend some of your super, get under the age pension cut-offs so that you can live on the pension, and then you've got, your home and your super nest egg to pass on to the next generation. Is that something that worries you?
Well, super is there for retirement. So the money is designed to be spent. Now, if people want to do their retirement planning, their succession planning, they can use a whole lot of other vehicles that are available to them. I think this is a compulsory pension scheme, and we want to keep the costs to be as low as possible. So super isn't there's almost like an obsession that you've got to have your money in super if you're going to be saving. I mean, you can have your money in a whole lot of various places. So I think we have to be clear-eyed about what the objective of super is, and I think it's to provide people income in retirement, get people off the pension, and to save the taxpayer money over the long term.
And your proposal here, just for those who may not have sort of picked up early on, you're talking about basically having a government-run default system that will charge low fees, deliver higher returns as a way of introducing competition.
Correct. And I think that is the best way for us to incentivise the existing default funds, which are the recipients of enormous public largesse, largely because of historical industrial or financial arrangements.
Look, Senator, thank you so much for joining us today and for putting up with my rather pointed questions at times. I think it's fantastic to have the sort of policy debate that we've seen here today. I want to thank everyone for tuning in and for those who are watching the future on YouTube. But just if I can, again, thank you, New South Wales Senator Andrew Bragg, for joining us to talk about super. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon, and thanks to the CIS for always supporting good policy ideas.
For decades, the CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound Liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical Liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.